So in the last episode, I talked about butterflies, specifically monarchs and viceroys. This week, I want to talk about a similar insect, moths, and explore some of the similarities between them and butterflies and some of the differences. I'll also tell you about a couple of pretty cool moths that can be found fluttering around in the darkness. Thanks for tuning in, Wild Wanderers. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Now, it should come as no surprise that moths and butterflies are pretty closely related. The two groups make up the scientific order Lepidoptera. There's about 180,000 species of Lepidoptera that have been described, which is about 10% of the total number of described species of living organisms. And Lepidoptera is the second largest order of insects. Beetles hold down the number one spot. But Lepidoptera is one of the most widespread and recognizable insect orders in the world. Plus, Lepidoptera is just fun to say. Go on, try it, I'll wait. See? But I would argue that of those 180,000 species of Lepidoptera, it's butterflies like the monarch and the viceroy and the swallowtail and the painted lady that are the most widely recognized, despite the fact that A, moths evolved long before butterflies. In fact, butterflies evolved from moths. Moth fossils have been found that date back 190 million years, while the oldest known butterfly fossil only dates back about 55 million years. And B, of those 180,000 Lepidoptera species, 160,000 are moths. But again, it's not too surprising that butterflies get more love than moths. Many moths are nocturnal. They're fluttering around at night in the dark when and where we don't usually see them. And moths, or more accurately moth caterpillars, are more likely to be considered pests. More on that a little later. Butterflies, on the other hand, are out during the day. They're visiting our flowers, pollinating, and showing off their pretty colors. In other words, they're more visible and they're entertaining us. But other than generally nocturnal versus generally diurnal, what's the difference between moths and butterflies? Well, let's play America's favorite game, Is That a Moth? But before we start, a quick disclaimer. There are very few absolutes in nature, and there are exceptions to darn near everything. But the following characteristics are at least good guiding principles to help you distinguish between adult moths and adult butterflies. First, let's look at antennae. Are they long and thin, usually with a teeny tiny ball at the end? That, my friend, is a butterfly. But if they're feathery or comb-like with no ball at the end, yes, that's a moth. Okay, how about wings? Well, if when resting the wings fold up vertically over the back, you're looking at a butterfly. But if the wings are held horizontally or tented so they hide the abdomen, that's a moth. Okay, last but not least, what about a Lepidoptera's body? Is it stout and hairy? We found a moth! Butterflies tend to have a slender and smoother abdomen. Now, there are several other differences between moths and butterflies, but some of these are not always obvious. I've already mentioned colors a little bit. Nocturnal moths are usually plain, brown, gray, white, or black, often with patterns or zigzags or swirls which help camouflage them from predators when they're resting during the day. Which makes perfect sense when you're nocturnal. In the dark, bright colors are just wasted. Nobody gets to see them. And it would suck to get eaten by something when you're trying to sleep. Butterflies tend to be more brightly colored, but again, there are exceptions to this. Many diurnal moths that are active during the daytime are brightly colored, especially if they're toxic. And in case you forgot, the word for that is aposematism. On a side note, diurnal moths evolved to locate their mates visually as opposed to primarily by pheromone like their less colorful nocturnal cousins. But I digress. There are several species of moth, some of which I'll talk about later, that are nocturnal but still have bright colors and striking patterns on their wings. Likewise, there are some butterflies that are just, well, meh. Moths and butterflies tend to have different types of eyes too, although you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at them. And to be fair, this is more of a diurnal nocturnal distinction than a butterfly moth distinction. Basically, most moths have eyes that are adapted for low light, while butterflies' eyes have better resolution and color vision. But diurnal moths have butterfly-type eyes, and there are nocturnal butterflies that have moth-type eyes. If you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, many moths also have a structure called a frenulum that's absent in all but one known species of butterfly, which connects their hind wings and their forewings. So that's how adult moths and butterflies differ. Let's look at life cycle. Like their butterfly cousins, moths have a 4-stage life cycle: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. Also like butterflies, most moths have specific host plants that their caterpillars feed on. Depending on what the host plant is, this is where moth larvae can become problematic. For example, corn earworm is considered an agricultural pest because it damages crops. In some cases, moth larvae will eat clothing or other items made of natural fibers, like cotton, leather, wool, or silk. Now in the wild, this is actually a good thing. The larvae of these moths help recycle nutrients by consuming the parts left behind by other scavengers, like skin and fur. But yeah, in your closet or underwear drawer, not such a good thing. And that's why they invented mothballs, which technically should be called larva balls or caterpillar balls. The problem with mothballs is that they're poisonous and they can adversely impact human health, not to mention pets and wildlife. And for the record, they don't deter snakes. That's a common myth, so use them only as directed if you're going to use them. Anyways, moth larvae can consume up to 2,700 times their own weight. Pupation is a point where moths and butterflies, with a few exceptions, diverge slightly. Instead of a chrysalis, which I talked about last episode, most moths spin a silken cocoon where they will undergo the same voodoo nature magic to turn into adult moths. Although I did read that they don't completely turn into goo, some structures like the trachea and the gut might be present throughout metamorphosis, but may grow or shrink accordingly to fit the adult form. But still, it's still voodoo nature magic. And again, there are exceptions. Moths that only build partial cocoons, moths that incorporate leaves into their cocoon, and moths that pupate without a cocoon, sometimes even underground. Now, fun fact, silk, the fabric, is actually made from the literal cocoon silk from the silkworm, the pupa of a domesticated species of moth. Now, while caterpillars may feed ravenously, some adult moths may not eat very much at all. Some adult moths live for a very short period of time, and I'm talking like a week, and may not even have functional mouth parts. But many moths feed on pollen and nectar, visiting flowers at night just like their diurnal relatives do in the daytime, which makes them important pollinators, especially of species that bees don't visit. A study conducted in the United Kingdom identified moths carrying pollen from 47 different plant species, including 7 species that are largely ignored by bees. Plants that are pollinated by moths generally grow in clusters that provide a sort of landing platform. They open in the late afternoon or evening, produce ample nectar that's deep in the flower, and are often white or dull in color because, again, like the moths themselves, bright colors are wasted in the dark. Now, this brings us to one of the challenges faced by nocturnal moths, which is light pollution, something I talked about back in episode 73. Moths navigate by the light of bright celestial objects, like, say, the moon. It lets them know which way is up and which way is down. Now, the moon, of course, is very far away, so if you fly in a straight line, the moon basically seems to stay in one place. But if the moth confuses your porch light or a street light, which of course is much closer, for the moon, it finds itself flying around and around that light in a futile attempt to go in a straight line. A 2014 study found that over 70% of nocturnal moths were drawn upward towards streetlights, away from flowering plants. And the result was a noticeable reduction in both plant pollination and the number of pollen types transported by the moths. And the results were consistent across several different moth species and over 28 different species of plant. Streetlights might also deter nocturnal moths from laying eggs and make them easier for predators to see. Surveys have shown that there are about half as many caterpillars in artificially lit areas compared to unlit areas. So you can see that light pollution is a very real problem for moths. Okay, before we wrap this up, let's look at a couple of specific species of moth. And I'm going to start with the Luna moth. Luna moths are found east of the Great Plains and are one of the larger moths found in North America. I would also argue they're one of the most beautiful despite being nocturnal. They're pretty easy to identify. The average wingspan is about 4.5 inches, so they're pretty large and they can reach nearly 7. Their bodies are white and hairy. Their wings are kind of a lime green with brown eye spots on both the forewing and the hind wings. And the hind wings end in long, sometimes slightly twisted tails. Eye spots are just what they sound like. They're spots that kind of look like eyes. Eye spots are found on several different species of Lepidoptera as well as other animals too, and they serve to confuse or deter predators. The long tails of the Luna moth's hind wings are thought to confuse the echolocation used by bats. Now, even Luna moth caterpillars have a defense against predators. They'll emit clicks as a warning, and they'll also vomit their stomach contents if they're feeling threatened. Gross? Maybe, but effective. This behavior has been proven to deter a number of potential predators. Now, depending on where they live, Luna moths will produce different numbers of generations per year. In the far northern part of their range, the northern US and southern Canada, they usually only produce 1 generation. In the southern part of their range, it can be as many as 3. Luna moth host plants are a variety of hardwood trees, although interestingly, host plants may vary by region, and larvae from one region may not be able to tolerate the host plants used by larvae in a different region. Eggs hatch in about 10 days. They spend 6 to 7 weeks as a larva. Pupation takes 2 to 3 weeks unless they go into diapause to overwinter, in which case it can take 9 months. But as an adult, they only live about a week. Adult Luna moths are one of those species that I mentioned that have only vestigial mouth parts and no digestive system. They survive that week on the energy they stored as caterpillars. Okay, now if you doubt what I said at the beginning, that butterflies get more love than moths, consider this. Despite being outnumbered 8 to 1, over 24 butterflies have appeared on US postage stamps, but the Luna moth is the only moth to have had this honor. All right, the last moth I want to talk about is the death's head hawk moth, because it's my 17-year-old's favorite and, as it turns out, really cool in more than just its appearance. The name death's head hawk moth is actually shared between 3 different but related species of moths. 2 of these species are native to Asia, and the other is found throughout Africa and Europe. These moths have a wingspan of about 5 inches. The abdomen is an orangey brown, but the most notable feature, at least visually, is a patch of short yellowish hairs on the thorax that kinda, sorta, with a little bit of imagination, looks a little bit like a human skull. Hence the name Death's Head Hawk Moth. But these moths don't just look like punk rock pirates, they walk the walk. First of all, they tend to be toxic. Host plants for eggs and larvae include those in the nightshade family. Secondly, all 3 species have the ability to emit a loud chirp if irritated. This sound is produced by inhaling and expelling air, often accompanied by flashing of the brightly colored abdomen, a startle defense, in a further attempt to deter predators. A study by National Geographic found that the structure that emits the chirp originally evolved to suck up honey, but later evolved to produce sound also. And yes, you heard that right, suck up honey. Adults of all 3 species are commonly observed raiding honeybee hives to feed on both nectar and honey. They can move about the hives without being disturbed because they mimic the scent of the bees and therefore are not recognized as intruders. And in the event their disguise is discovered, the moth's thick waxy cuticle helps protect it from stings. I'm just saying, flying a skull flag and plundering for treasure, if that's not pirate behavior, I don't know what is. And with that, the sun will set on this episode. If you want to help moths, find out what night-blooming plants are native to your area or what native moths in your area prefer as host plants, and plant those in your garden. And like I said a few episodes ago, turn off those outside lights. Give the moths a little love. After all, they're pollinators too. Now, if you want to help me out, here's some ways you can do that too. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. That's less than most coffee drinks at most decent coffee drink outlet places. You can find all the information at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. If you want to make a one-time donation or send me an email with questions, comments, or concerns or suggestions for future episodes, you can do that at dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. That's both my email address and my PayPal address. You can buy some merch. There's all kinds of stuff to be had with the awesome Dispatches from the Forest logo on it. Check it all out at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest, and then click on products and you can see everything in all its glory. For additional content, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.